Mr. Speaker, and it's a privilege to speak here on behalf of my constituents, Sturgeon River Parkland, today in the House. And I also want to wish every member of this House and the Canadian people a very happy St. Crispin's Day. And I'm going to start by a small excerpt from a speech from Shakespeare's Henry V, in which the king, before the Battle of Agincourt, said, "By Jove, I'm not covetous for gold, but if it be a sin to be covetous for honor, then I am the most offending soul alive." Wow. And I think that's illustrative of the debate that we're having here today, when people are more covetous for gold than they are for their own honor. Here. And I think we've seen that very clearly with the debacle at the Sustainable Development Technology Council. Mr. Speaker, there's never been a better time in this country's history to be a liberal insider than under this Liberal government. And after 9 years, this government's really shown no restraint in enriching their friends. And as we approach the dying days of this government, the Liberals are more desperate than ever to hide the truth, going to extraordinary lengths to block the release of documents into this terrible, terrible scandal. $400 million we're talking about of taxpayers' money that was misappropriated by the Sustainable Development Technology Council. Now, why are we here today? To my constituents who may just be tuning into the debate here, we're talking about parliamentary privilege. Members of the House of Commons have something called parliamentary privilege. It's a sacred principle that we inherited from Westminster. Erskine May's treatise on the law, privileges, proceedings, and usages of Parliament defines parliamentary privilege as thus, quote, "Parliamentary privilege is the sum of certain rights enjoyed by each House collectively, and by members of each House individually, without which they could not discharge their functions, and which exceed those possessed by other bodies or individuals." This Liberal government has violated the rights of Parliament and parliamentarians by refusing to turn over all the unredacted documents relating to the scandal at the Sustainable Development Technology Council. Now, the powers of parliamentary privilege are rooted in the Constitution Act of 1867 and the Parliament of Canada Act. This issue is such a significant issue that has led to essentially the shutdown of all other parliamentary debate as we undergo this privilege motion. Now, some members, including a member across recently, have pointed to the previous government's refusal in 2011 to release documents. Well, the fact is that this issue was taken to a higher power. In fact, the highest power of the land. What power is that, you may ask? The people. And they decided to give that government a majority mandate after an election was fought. The people, the highest power, vindicated the government of the day's position. The fact is that this Liberal minority government has no mandate from the people to defy the will of Parliament. And if they believe they do, which clearly they do, they should call an election so that they can get that mandate from the people. But the fact is they're not willing to go to the highest power in the land because they already know what that answer will be.
A massive defeat.
It will be a resounding rejection of their decision to defy the will of Parliament and refuse these documents. Now, if they want to keep hiding these documents in violation of parliamentary supremacy, they must call an election to get a mandate from the people. Now, I want to go into how this motion that was put forward came to be and why we're here today. The Auditor General of Canada, an independent office, investigated Sustainable Technology Development Canada and found that Liberal appointees gave $400 million of taxpayer dollars to their own companies, involving 186 instances of conflicts of interest. The Prime Minister's former industry minister, Navdeep Bains, handpicked these board members and their chair to manage $1 billion in taxpayer funds. In February of 2023, employees at the fund, this came from within the organization itself, filed a complaint. And that complaint led to this investigation, a complaint for which Conservatives fought to get an investigation for, a complaint which this Liberal government fought tooth and nail to avoid an investigation over. And when the Auditor General's report was made public, they found there was 186 conflicts of interest involving the board and the chair. They did a sample, and they found that 82% of the cases that they investigated had a conflict of interest. 82% of cases. This isn't just an off case where somebody, maybe mistook the rules and had a minor interest in something and didn't think it mattered. 82% of cases in a sample taken showed conflicts of interest. In one case, Annette Verschuren, who was the Liberal-appointed chair of this Green Slush Fund, gave $217,000 to her own company, and they have yet to return the money. According to one of the whistleblowers from the organization, quote, "Our democratic systems and institutions are being corrupted by political interference." The people in the organization itself are saying that there is political interference going through this case. Now, this fund operated well. There was laudable goals, providing funding to promote sustainable development and new technologies. I know there's companies in my riding that have accessed this funding. But under this Liberal government, it's been allowed to turn into a slush fund. In fact, under the previous Conservative government, when this fund was looked into, it was given a clean bill of health.
That's right.
It's only under this Liberal government, under the decay, under the negligence, under the turning a blind eye to corruption, that this once pristine institution, this once pristine organization, has been allowed to descend into the mires of this corruption. And though SDTC should be at arm's length from the government, it isn't. It was found in numerous cases that this government had intricate involvements in the day-to-day affairs of SDTC, something that makes it ripe for corruption and ripe for political interference. I want to go in to talk about some of the cases here, just to elaborate for Canadians just how serious this is. And one board member, who was a board member from 2015 to 2021, their companies they had an interest in, received $114 million while they were sitting on the board. They didn't recuse themselves. In this case, the company in question, Cycle Capital, the value of this company tripled during this member's time on the board of directors. And you know who was Cycle Capital's paid lobbyist during this time period? Well, it was the current Liberal Minister for the Environment. Talk about strong ties. This person was appointed to the Infrastructure Bank's board of directors in 2021. No bad deed goes unrewarded under this Liberal government, and allocated an additional $170 million to Annette Verschuren's company when Verschuren was the chair of SDTC. Now, the Minister of Environment, before entering Parliament, was the lobbyist for this company that tripled in value, that received an immense amount of funds from this fund. He lobbied 25 times just in the year before he was elected to the House. The Prime Minister's office and the Industry Department gave his client over $100 million from this fund. And when he became a cabinet minister, it didn't end. He approved $750 million in funding through SDTC, and $250 million of that went to guess who? Cycle Capital, a company that the minister continues to hold shares in to this day. In another case of a slush fund board member, who was handpicked by the Prime Minister, admitted in committee that $17 million went to companies in which he had interest. $17 million. In another case, a former political staffer, who was a political staffer for a Liberal Environment Minister, David Anderson, who was a political organizer for the Prime Minister in British Columbia, approved $5 million for companies in which he had an interest. The board chair, who I've mentioned before, Minister Navdeep Bains replaced the previous chair of the Sustainable Development Technology Council with Annette Verschuren, after the previous chair criticized the government's tech policies. So much for listening to the experts. So much for muzzling experts. You know who that previous board chair was? Jim Balsillie, one of the pioneering tech entrepreneurs of our country, started BlackBerry. In fact, Jim Balsillie warned this government about the conflict of interest of appointing Ms. Verschuren, but they ignored it anyways. In fact, the minister at the time knew that her companies were receiving funds, and yet appointed her anyways. The minister at the time, the Liberal minister, ignored repeated warnings from the Privy Council office, from the Prime Minister's office, and his own office. In fact, in one case, Ms. Verschuren herself even told him that she had a conflict of interest, but that wasn't good enough for this Liberal government. They were going to go ahead and appoint their hand-picked chair. Verschuren moved a motion and voted to send $220,000 to her own company. And the ethics commissioner, this isn't just me saying it, the ethics commissioner has found her guilty of violating her ethics laws. I'm going to quote from some of the whistleblowers, because so many of these whistleblowers have come forward. Those of you watching, maybe you want to give the government the benefit of the doubt. Maybe it's just the Conservatives spreading misinformation. Well, here's some quotes from whistleblowers from the organization itself. Quote, "The true failure of this situation lies at the feet of our current Liberal government." Quote, "Our democratic systems and institutions are being corrupted by political interference." Quote, "A straightforward process became a bureaucratic nightmare, allowing SDDC to waste millions and abuse employees." Quote, "The current government is more focused on protecting itself from public scrutiny." Another whistleblower said, "I think the Auditor General's investigation was more of a cursory review. I don't think the goal and mandate of the Auditor General's office is actually to look into criminality. And I'm not surprised by the fact that they haven't found anything criminal, because they're not looking at intent. If their investigation was focused on intent, of course they would find criminality." Another whistleblower, "I know the federal government, like the minister, has continued saying that there was no criminal intent and nothing was found, but I think the committee would agree that they're not to be trusted in this situation. I would happily agree to whatever findings are made by the RCMP, but I would say that I wouldn't trust that there isn't any criminality unless the RCMP is given the full authority to investigate." And that's what we're debating here, is giving the RCMP the full unredacted documents, not just the documents that the government wants to give them, the documents that Parliament has ordered them to give to the RCMP. Another whistleblower, "Again, if you bring in the RCMP and they do their investigation, they find something or they don't, I think the public would be happy with that. But I don't think we should just leave it to this current federal government or the ruling party to make those decisions. Let the public see what's in there. Just as I have always been confident that the Auditor General would confirm the financial mismanagement, I am equally confident that the RCMP will substantiate the criminal activities that occurred within the organization." In terms of all the information the RCMP has received from ISED or the Auditor General, the question to them is, were any of them looking for criminal intent? It's one thing to say no criminal intent was found, but the question to ask the Auditor General or anyone else is, were they looking for criminal intent or were they not? And if you look at the scope of the RCGT report or the Auditor General's report, that was not within the scope of their mandate. And that's why we need the RCMP to investigate. It wasn't in the scope of the Auditor General's mandate to look into whether there was criminal actions. On the surface, I think there is evidence that points to possible criminal actions. But that's really up for the RCMP, and they can't do their job unless they get the full documents. Now, Mr. Speaker, why must the House obtain these documents? Well, whistleblowers claim that criminal intent would be found if the documents are given to the RCMP. So this government should not be withholding these documents in any way. A majority of members in this House passed a motion demanding that these documents be turned over. And the Liberals refused, or heavily sent heavily redacted documents instead. The Leader of the Opposition has argued that Parliament's rights were breached, and the Speaker of the House agreed. This is not the only Liberal scam. We know during the pandemic that Liberals gave themselves unlimited taxing and spending powers. We know that the Prime Minister has been found guilty of violating ethics laws 4 times. We know that the Prime Minister tried to hand $900 million to a company that was paying his own family members. And I found it very interesting going back over the We Charity debates to learn that there was many other wonderful people who had wonderful experiences who were speaking at these We Charity events. They weren't getting paid anything. Curiously, it only appeared to be members of the Prime Minister's family that were getting paid. What a coincidence. Questions that still need to be asked, answers that have yet to be given. We know that in 2021, this government took the Speaker of the House to court over the Winnipeg lab documents. The House asked for those documents. We fought an election on it. This government was handed a minority mandate with a lower percentage of the popular vote than the Conservative Party. They don't have a clear mandate. They were given a mandate to work with other parties in this House. And this government has refused to work with members. They have stonewalled and refused to give these documents in defiance to the will of Parliament, a mandate that they did not get from the Canadian people in the last election.
That's right.
We're only scratching the surface. The Auditor General was only able to review half of the transactions in this case. And we know that a full review, when we consider that 82% of a sample size had conflicts of interest, we know that a full review is going to show even more conflicts of interest. The CFO of the industry department himself called this worse than the sponsorship scandal. What is this government trying to hide? This is just the tip of the iceberg. And that's how it starts. I remember my late friend who sadly passed away this summer, John Williams, former MP, former chair of the Public Accounts Committee, who relentlessly worked on a little-known issue called the sponsorship scandal, ad scam. Happened in the 90s. Some people started talking about it. It really blew up in the 2000s. And it was only because of the relentless work of opposition parties in this Parliament and that committee that Canadians got the truth. And then the Gomery inquiry, which showed that this Liberal Party misappropriated funds, were sending funds to ad agencies, funds which were being returned to the Liberal Party in the form of donations. And my late friend John Williams passed away this summer, always told me that the thing that separates a great society from a failing society is accountability. That was his watchword in his life, accountability. And under this Liberal government, accountability has been allowed to go by the wayside.
That's right.
We're doing our best here in the opposition. We're standing up here every day exposing this government's corruption. We're exposing their lack of transparency. Remember when they were talking about open by default back in 2015? Sunny ways. We've come a long way in these past 9 years. I think Canadians would be right to be pretty cynical about this Liberal government.
That's right.
You know, they talk a lot about slogans in this House, but we remember those slogans. And they've been tossed to the wayside along with accountability, Mr. Speaker. And it's that accountability that's so essential because in great societies, when we have institutions that work as they should, when we have government that respects the rule of law, respects the wills of their Parliament, there is transparency. And when there's transparency, there's accountability. And when there's accountability, people do their job and don't steal money. They don't covet gold, they covet honor.
Hear, hear.
And we should all covet honor in this House. We should all be proud to be the most guilty person to covet honor. But under this Liberal government, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars, if you're looking at the broad swath of scandals that have happened under 9 years of this Liberal government, we've seen that what has been allowed to fester in this country is the coveting of gold, the coveting of taxpayer money, which has been misappropriated for the benefit of the few to the detriment of the people.
That's right.
The people, the highest power in the land, the people who send us here, the people that give us a job to do, the people that we have to be accountable to at the end of the day. Now, Conservatives will always push for accountability. We're the people that brought in the Accountability Act, after all. And I think after we form government again, there's going to have to be some revisions to that Accountability Act, because after 9 years of this Liberal government, they've certainly given us a lot of examples of the ways that they can get around those rules, that they can abuse the processes. And so I think there's going to have to be a lot of updates to that document, because they've given us a lot of lessons in what not to do and how not to run a government. This Liberal government's comfortable with wasting hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. There doesn't appear to be any real effort from this government to recoup that money. They've broken the trust of hardworking Canadians. They've broken the trust. The Prime Minister's trust has been broken.
They've broken Canada.
They've broken Canada. The Liberals do not have a mandate to defy the will of Parliament. They do not have a mandate to withhold these documents from the RCMP. And if they want to get a mandate, as I said earlier, it's time to call an election.
That's right.
So that the Canadian people can decide if they're right or wrong. Now, I'm not afraid to ask that question. But I know the members on the other side are afraid to ask that question.
Here.
And so let's get to an election right now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.